The desert winds of Uzar Prime carried the scent of blood and burnt ozone as Aymara Ven stepped off the diplomatic shuttle onto the scorching tarmac. The year was 3245 SC, and the Uzar Empire was tearing itself apart. The once mighty civilization that had ruled over 12 systems for millennia was now embroiled in a civil war that threatened to reduce their homeworld to rubble. Behind me, my aide carried the sealed diplomatic pouch containing Earth's response to Duke Endova's unprecedented request. The Duke wanted human mercenaries, us, to help him overthrow his rivals and claim the imperial throne. What he didn't understand was that humans had learned to be very, very good at war. And once you invite us to your fight, it becomes hard to make us leave. The Duke's palace rose before us like a twisted spear of crystal and steel, its bioluminescent walls pulsing with the Empire's traditional blue-green light. As Earth's ambassador to Uzar, I'd been here countless times, but never under circumstances quite like these. The humans back on our ravaged homeworld, our beautiful rain-soaked, acid-scarred Earth that orbited a dying sun, needed this contract. But I had a sinking feeling that the Uzar Empire needed it far less than they realized. Duke Endova met us in his war room, a vast circular chamber where holographic star charts showed the positions of loyal and rebel fleets. The Duke himself was an imposing figure even by Uzar standards. His pale blue skin was marked with the traditional scarification of military rank, and his forearms moved in the graceful hypnotic patterns that served as both gesture and language among his people. "Ambassador Ven," he said in accented standard, his throat sacs expanding and contracting with each word. "I trust your journey from Earth was satisfactory. As satisfactory as any journey through war-torn space can be, Your Grace." I replied, setting down the diplomatic pouch with deliberate care. "The Human Colonial Council has reviewed your proposal." The Duke's primary eyes fixed on the pouch, while his secondary eyes continued to monitor the tactical displays around the room. It was a distinctly Uzar trait, the ability to focus on multiple tasks simultaneously. A trait that had served them well as galactic administrators, but perhaps not so well when it came to understanding the singular focused intensity with which humans approached warfare. And Duke Endova asked, though I could see he already knew the answer from my expression. "We accept," I said simply. The Duke's relief was palpable, but I felt only a growing dread in my stomach. "Excellent. My military advisors estimate we'll need approximately 50,000 human soldiers. Your people's reputation for long-range tactics and biological augmentation should give us a decisive advantage against Empress Indula's forces." "Your Grace," I said carefully, "I feel compelled to point out that hiring human mercenaries has historically proven complicated for other species." Duke Endova's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Ambassador, with respect, the tales of human military contractors are greatly exaggerated. You're warriors, yes, but you're also professionals. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." I opened the diplomatic pouch and withdrew the contract, a thin sheet of smart matter that shimmered with embedded holographic seals. "Nevertheless, I recommend you read the fine print very carefully, particularly clauses 15 through 27, which detail post-conflict territorial and governance considerations." The Duke barely glanced at the document before pressing his upper hand to the biometric scanner. The contract flashed green, binding our peoples to an agreement that would change the fate of both species. "There," he said with satisfaction. "It is done. When can your forces arrive?" "They're already here," I said quietly. The Duke's four eyes widened in surprise, and he turned to his tactical displays. Sure enough, the sensors showed a fleet of human ships decloaking just beyond Uzar Prime's moon. Sleek, angular vessels that looked more like predatory insects than traditional spacecraft. "How many?" the Duke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 50,000 troops as requested, plus support staff, medical teams, and technical advisors. Oh, and Secretary General Cale Thorne sends his regards. He'll be arriving personally to oversee operations." Duke Endova nodded slowly, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. I wasn't aware the human colonial secretary general would be involved personally. You hired humans, Your Grace. We take our contracts seriously. Over the following weeks, I watched with a mixture of pride and horror as human forces transformed the Uzar Civil War. Our soldiers were unlike anything the natives had ever encountered. Where Uzar warfare had traditionally been a matter of honor ceremony and direct confrontation, humans brought a cold pragmatism that was utterly alien to the Empire's military traditions. The first engagement was at the Crystalline Plains, a vast desert where Empress Indala's forces had dug in around a series of ancient monument fortresses. The Uzar expected a frontal assault, perhaps some ceremonial challenges between champions. Instead, human forces bypassed the monuments, entirely striking at supply lines and communication nodes with surgical precision. Dr. Ilka Soren, the Empire's leading expert on biological augmentation, had worked with human engineers to upgrade our soldiers' already formidable enhancement packages. The result was troops who could operate for days without sleep soldiers, whose enhanced eyes could see clearly in Uzar Prime's frequent dust storms, and warriors whose augmented reflexes made them unnaturally fast even by human standards. But it was the psychological warfare that truly caught the Uzar off guard. Humans had learned through centuries of conflict on Earth, and in the colonies, that breaking an enemy's will to fight was often more effective than breaking their armies. When Empress Indala's forces found their water supplies mysteriously contaminated, not poisoned, just made to taste terrible, and their waste disposal systems systematically sabotaged morale, plummeted faster than their casualty rates. General Varick, commander of the Duke's traditional forces, came to me 3 weeks into the campaign. The old soldier was clearly troubled, his scarification patterns flickering with the subdued colors that indicated distress among his people. Ambassador Venn, he said, I must speak freely. Of course, General. Your people fight, strangely. They show no honor in battle. They strike from shadows, they poison wells. They turn our own weapons against us through some technological trickery. I don't pretend to understand. Is this truly warfare? I sighed, watching through the command center's windows, as a squadron of human jetpack troops disappeared into the red haze of an approaching sandstorm. General, I tried to warn the Duke about this. Humans learned to fight dirty because we had to. Our homeworld became a battleground long before we reached the stars. Every conflict taught us new ways to survive, and survival rarely follows the rules of honor. But surely, as fellow warriors, you understand? General, I interrupted gently, we're not fellow warriors. You are warriors. We are survivors. There's a difference. The difference became even more apparent as Duke Endava's debts began to mount. Human mercenary services weren't cheap, and the war was dragging on longer than anyone had anticipated. Empress Indala proved surprisingly resilient, falling back deeper into the Empire's heartlands, rather than engaging in the decisive battles the Duke had hoped for. Secretary General Cale Thorne was a lean, sharp-faced man in his 50s, who wore his biological augmentations like badges of office. Unlike the subtle modifications most humans preferred, his enhancements were deliberately visible, silver neural interface ports at his temples, reinforced bone structure that gave his features an angular, predatory cast, and eyes that occasionally flashed with the telltale light of direct data access. Ambassador, he said during one of our increasingly frequent private meetings, the Duke's payments are becoming irregular. We were sitting in my quarters in the human compound, a cluster of prefabricated buildings that had sprung up like mushrooms near the Duke's palace. Through my window, I could see human soldiers drilling on the parade ground, their movements synchronized with a precision that made the Uzar military advisors shake their heads in bewilderment. I'm aware of the financial situation, I replied. Perhaps we could extend more favorable terms. Why would we do that? Cale's enhanced eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was unsettling even to another human. We're winning this war for them. The Empress's forces are in full retreat. Within another month, we'll have effective control of 3/4 of the Empire's territory. That's exactly what worries me, I said. We came here to help the Duke claim the throne, not to conquer the Uzar Empire ourselves. Kale smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Who says we're conquering anything? We're simply ensuring our contract terms are honored. And if the Duke can't pay us in monetary compensation, well, perhaps we need to discuss alternative arrangements. This was what I had feared from the moment we'd accepted the Duke's contract. Humans were excellent at war, but we were also excellent at finding ways to justify continuing wars. It was how we'd managed to survive on post-apocalyptic Earth after all, by taking what we needed and finding reasons why we deserved it. The crisis came to a head during the siege of Fort Viridian Empress Indala's last major stronghold before the capital city. The fortress was ancient, its walls embedded with crystalline structures that made it nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Human engineers, however, had found a way to reverse the polarity of the crystal's defensive field, turning the fortress's own defenses into weapons. As I watched the massive structure begin to collapse under its own defensive emissions, Duke Endova arrived at the human command post. He looked haggard, the blue-green luminescence of his skin dim with exhaustion. "Ambassador," he said, "I need to speak with you about the Secretary General's latest demands." I glanced around the command post where human officers were efficiently coordinating the assault. This was exactly the conversation I'd hoped to avoid having in front of them. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," I suggested. "No," the Duke said firmly. "Let them hear. The Secretary General is demanding we grant human citizens full political rights within the Empire. He wants human settlements on 12 different worlds with autonomous governance. He wants—" The Duke's voice cracked slightly. "He wants to partition the Empire." A silence fell over the command post. Several officers exchanged glances, and I realized with a sinking heart that this wasn't news to them. Kale had been planning this all along. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "perhaps we should review the original contract terms." "I've read every clause of that blasted contract," Duke Endova snapped, "including clauses 15 through 27, which I now realize I should have considered more carefully. They give humans extensive rights to territorial compensation in the event of extended operational commitment or failure of monetary remittance." Colonel Sarah Reeves, Kale's second-in-command, stepped forward. She was a veteran of the water wars on Earth, with radiation scars along her left arm and the kind of 1,000-yard stare that came from too many battles. "Duke Endova, with respect you contracted for our services, knowing full well that human military doctrine prioritizes strategic objectives over tactical ones. We're simply ensuring long-term stability." "By carving up my empire," the Duke demanded. "By creating sustainable power structures that ensure lasting peace," Colonel Reeves replied smoothly. "Human administrative efficiency has been proven effective across multiple systems." I felt a surge of anger, not at the Duke, but at my own people. This was exactly why other species feared dealing with humans. We had a talent for making reasonable-sounding justifications for unreasonable actions. "Colonel," I said, my voice carrying the authority of my ambassadorial rank, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our mandate here." "Has there?" Kale Thorne's voice came from behind us. I turned to see the Secretary General entering the command post, flanked by 2 heavily augmented bodyguards. "Because my understanding is quite clear. We were contracted to ensure Duke Endova's victory. And victory, Ambassador, isn't just about defeating the enemy. It's about securing a sustainable outcome." The Duke's scarification patterns flared angry red. "I hired mercenaries, not occupiers." "You hired humans," Kale replied with a shrug. "The distinction is often academic." That night, after the Duke had stormed out and the fortress had finally fallen, I found myself walking through the human camp. Our soldiers were celebrating the victory, but there was an edge to the festivities that I didn't like. This wasn't the satisfaction of a job well done. This was the excitement of predators who'd tasted blood. I was approached by Dr. Ilka Soren, the Uzar scientist who'd been working with our biotechnology teams. Unlike most Uzar, she'd learned to read human expressions fairly well, and she looked troubled. "Ambassador Ven," she said, "may I speak freely?" "Always, Doctor. The biological augmentations we've been developing, they're remarkable. But I'm concerned about some of the psychological effects. Several human soldiers have reported unusual thoughts, increased aggression, territorial instincts, a reluctance to stand down from combat status, even when off duty." I felt a chill despite the desert heat. "How many soldiers?" "Perhaps 10% of those who received the full enhancement package, and the percentage is growing." This was another wrinkle I hadn't anticipated. Human augmentation technology was advanced, but still experimental in many ways. The idea that our soldiers might be becoming psychologically unstable was terrifying, especially when those soldiers were increasingly talking about permanent security arrangements for the territory they'd conquered. The coronation of Empress Indula, or rather her forced abdication, and the Duke's assumption of the imperial throne, was scheduled to take place in the Grand Palace of Uzar Prime. It was to be a ceremony of unification, bringing together the various factions that had torn the empire apart. I had hoped it would also be an opportunity to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal of human forces. Instead, it became the stage for the final confrontation. The Grand Palace was a marvel of Uzar architecture, its living walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that responded to the emotional state of occupants. As hundreds of Uzar nobles filed into the coronation chamber, the walls rippled with colors of anticipation, anxiety, and poorly concealed fear. Duke Endova, soon to be Emperor Endova, looked magnificent in the traditional flowing robes of state. But I noticed the way his eyes kept darting to the human security teams positioned around the chamber. What had begun as a precautionary measure had become something else entirely. Empress Indula was brought in under guard, her wrists bound with ceremonial chains that were decidedly non-ceremonial in their efficacy. Despite her defeat, she carried herself with dignified grace, and the walls responded to her presence with deep purples and blues, the colors of nobility, under duress. Secretary General Thorne stood with me in the diplomatic section, and I could see the gleam of satisfaction in his augmented eyes. "A historic day, Ambassador," he said quietly. "Indeed it is," I replied, checking the time display on my neural interface. In exactly 10 minutes, human soldiers would receive a coded transmission that would activate contingency protocols throughout the Empire. Protocols that would effectively turn our mercenary forces into an occupation army. I couldn't let it happen. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed beings," I said, my voice enhanced by the chamber's acoustic systems to carry to every corner of the room. "Before we proceed with the coronation, I believe there are certain matters that require clarification." The chamber fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. Duke Endova looked puzzled while Secretary General Thorne's expression hardened. "Ambassador," Thorne said warningly, "this isn't the time." "On the contrary," I interrupted, pulling out a holographic projector. "This is exactly the time." The hologram bloomed to life above the center of the chamber, showing detailed plans for the human occupation of Uzar space. Fleet positions, administrative structures, territorial divisions, everything Kale had been planning in secret. "What you see before you," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "is Secretary General Thorne's vision for the future of the Uzar Empire. A future where humans control your major worlds, your trade routes, and your government." A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled nobles, and the walls flashed angry reds and oranges. Duke Endova stared at the hologram, his 4 arms trembling with rage. "You dare! I hired you as soldiers, not as conquerors." "You hired humans," Secretary General Thorne replied, his hand moving to the weapon at his side. "And now, you'll live with the consequences of that decision." That was the moment everything went wrong. Thorne's bodyguards moved to restrain me, but I'd been expecting that. What I hadn't been expecting was the speed with which the augmented soldiers throughout the chamber responded to some signal I hadn't detected. In seconds, The coronation had become a hostage situation, with human weapons trained on every major noble in the room. Sir Colonel Reeves reported to Thorne via her comm unit. All strategic positions are secured. The Uzar military has been neutralized. The walls of the chamber were now a chaotic swirl of colors. Red for anger, yellow for fear, deep black for despair. In the center of it all, Duke Endova and Empress Indula stood together, united for the first time in decades by their shared revulsion at what was happening. "This is not what we agreed to," Duke Endova said, his voice steady, despite the weapons pointed at him. "Your contract was to defeat Empress Indula and secure the throne," Thorne replied. "Congratulations, Your Grace, you've won. The throne is yours. The Empire, however, is now under new management." I felt sick. This was everything I'd feared about human military contractors, everything I'd tried to warn the Duke about. We were too good at war, and too good at justifying why we deserved to keep fighting. But there was one thing Cale had forgotten about me. I was a diplomat first and a human second. "Secretary General," I said loudly, "I invoke Article 7 of the Human Colonial Charter." Thorne's eyes snapped to me. "You can't be serious." Article 7 grants any duly appointed ambassador the authority to countermand military actions that violate the principles of the Charter, including actions that constitute unprovoked aggression against allied species. "The Uzar aren't our allies," Colonel Reeves protested. "They became our allies the moment we signed a mutual defense contract with them," I replied. "A contract which explicitly states that human forces will act in the Empire's best interests, not against them." The chamber was dead silent. Even the walls had stopped shifting colors, frozen in a pattern of deep uncertainty. Secretary General Thorne's face was a mask of fury. "You're making a mistake, Ambassador. The political situation back on Earth—" "We'll have to adapt," I said firmly. "Just as we've all had to adapt." What happened next was a standoff that lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Human soldiers with weapons trained on Uzar nobles, Uzar guards with weapons trained on human soldiers, and in the center of it all, a group of diplomats and aristocrats trying to find a way out of a situation that threatened to destroy two civilizations. It was Empress Indula who broke the deadlock. "I propose," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had ruled an empire for 40 years, "that we negotiate a new arrangement. One that acknowledges the reality of human military power while preserving Uzar sovereignty." "What kind of arrangement?" Duke Endova asked. "A joint council," I suggested quickly, seeing an opening. "Uzar nobility and human representatives sharing governmental authority. A constitutional monarchy with built-in checks and balances." Secretary General Thorne's laugh was bitter. "And why exactly should we accept that we hold all the military cards?" "Because," Empress Indula said, stepping forward despite the weapons trained on her, "you need us to govern. You can conquer our worlds, but you can't run our civilization. You don't understand our people, our customs, our economics. Without us, you'll be trying to rule a population that will resist you for generations." She had a point, and I could see that Thorne knew it. Human military doctrine was excellent for conquest, but occupation was a different kind of warfare entirely, one that we'd never been particularly good at. "A trial period," I suggested. 6 months of joint governance with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. If it doesn't work, we can revise the arrangement. "And if it does work," Duke Endova asked. "Then we'll have created something unprecedented," I said. "A truly integrated human-alien political system." The negotiations that followed were complicated, tense, and often heated. But gradually, a framework emerged. The Balance of Power Accord, as it came to be known, established a unique form of government, the Joint Uzar-Terran Council, with rotating leadership and carefully balanced representation. Under the new system, Duke Endova would become emperor, but with limited powers. Major decisions would require approval from both the Uzar Senate and the Human Colonial Assembly. Human forces would remain on key worlds, but under joint command structures that included Uzar officers at every level. Most importantly, A new position was created, the ambassador mediator, whose job would be to ensure that both species' interests were protected and that future conflicts could be resolved without military intervention. 3 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new office in the joint government complex, watching as human and Uzar construction crews worked together to build the new capital of what was already being called the Uzar-Terran Alliance. The site was still surreal humans in environmental suits, working alongside Uzar in their traditional bio-armor, their different physiologies complementing each other in unexpected ways. Secretary General Thorne had been recalled to Earth ostensibly for debriefing, but really because his aggressive approach had become a political liability once news of the attempted occupation spread through human space. The Colonial Council had, after much debate, officially endorsed the alliance as a bold experiment in interspecies cooperation. Emperor Endava, he had decided to keep his title, after all, appeared beside me on the balcony. The last few months had aged him considerably, but he seemed more at peace than when I'd first met him. Ambassador Mediator Ven, he said, using my new title, "I must confess, when I first hired human mercenaries, I never imagined it would lead to this." "Neither did I, Your Majesty," I admitted. "But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. The integration is proceeding faster than either of our species predicted," he noted, watching, as a human engineer and an Uzar architect bent over the same set of blueprints. "Dr. Soren tells me that human and Uzar biotechnology are remarkably compatible. Our youngsters are already learning each other's languages in school. And our merchants are making fortunes trading technologies and cultural goods," I added with a smile. "Nothing like profit motive to encourage cooperation." The Emperor's laugh was lighter than I'd ever heard it. "True enough, though I sometimes wonder what will happen when the next crisis comes. Will our alliance hold?" I thought about that for a moment, watching as the binary sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Your Majesty, I think the real test isn't whether we can stay allies in times of crisis. It's whether we can remember to stay human and Uzar as well. That's the real challenge of any alliance." Wise words. He paused. "And if another species ever asks me for advice about hiring human mercenaries," I grinned, "tell them to read the fine print, all of it, twice." As if summoned by our conversation, my aide, a young Uzar named Dek Vena, who'd taken a human-style name in honor of our partnership, appeared with a data pad. "Ambassador Mediator," he said, his throat sacs contracting in the pattern that indicated urgent news. "We've received a diplomatic message from the Sector Council. The Thrakari Republic is requesting human military assistance with their civil war." I sighed. The Thrakari were a proud species of crystal-based beings who'd managed to maintain their independence for 2,000 years. If they were asking for human mercenaries, things must be desperate. "Has anyone told them about the Uzar situation?" I asked. "They seem to think they can manage human contractors better than we did," Emperor Endava said with dark amusement. I shook my head. "Some species never learn. Dek, please prepare a response. Tell the Thrakari that the Uzar-Terran Alliance would be happy to provide military advisors and peacekeeping forces under joint command and with full diplomatic oversight." "And if they insist on hiring human mercenaries directly?" Dek asked. I looked out over the growing city below us, where two very different species were learning to work together, to live together, to build something new together. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, misunderstandings, conflicts that required constant negotiation. But it was something unprecedented in galactic history. "Then we'll offer them our most experienced diplomatic advisor," I said, finally. "Someone who can be there to help them understand exactly what they're getting into." "And who might that be?" the Emperor asked, though I could see he already suspected the answer. "Dr. Ilka Soren," I said. "She's been working on a comprehensive study of human psychological augmentation and its effects on long-term occupation doctrine. I think the Thrakari would find her insights educational." The Emperor's scarification patterns flickered with amusement. You're going to give them a scientific analysis of exactly how humans turn temporary military contracts into permanent political arrangements. Knowledge is power, Your Majesty. And sometimes the best way to prevent a disaster is to help people understand exactly how that disaster might unfold. As the sun set behind the mountains of Uzar Prime, I reflected on the strange path that had brought us here. The Duke's desperate plea for mercenaries had led to something none of us had anticipated: not conquest, not occupation, but synthesis. A new kind of civilization that was neither purely human nor purely Uzar, but something entirely different. The truth about human mercenaries wasn't just that we were dangerous or that we were hard to get rid of once we'd been hired. The truth was that we changed things. We brought our own culture, our own ideas, our own ways of seeing the universe. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very careful, that change could be something positive. But as I watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I couldn't help but think about the Thrakari and their coming request. Because there was one more truth about human mercenaries that I hadn't shared with Emperor Endova, one that I hoped the galaxy would never have to learn again. We always kept our contracts, all of them, even the ones we didn't remember making. And sometimes the most dangerous contract of all was the one we made with ourselves, the promise that wherever we went, whatever we did, we would survive, no matter the cost.